The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before opening it that my day was about to get significantly worse. I am Xavier Norris, a construction contractor who has lived in the Meadowbrook Heights development in Phoenix, Arizona for the past 3 years. I bought my modest ranch house on the outskirts of the sprawling subdivision because the price was right, and the commute to most of my job sites was reasonable. The homeowners association seemed tolerable enough during the initial walk-through, though I should have paid more attention to the thick covenant document they made me sign. The envelope bore the official seal of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA, and inside was a violation notice printed on cream-colored cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than my morning coffee. The complaint stated that my Bobcat T595 skid steer, which I had parked in my driveway after a long day grading a commercial lot, was visible from the street and violated Section 17.4 of the Community Guidelines regarding commercial vehicles and equipment. The fine was $500. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. The skid steer had been sitting there for exactly 1 evening. I had gotten home late, exhausted, and planned to load it back onto my trailer first thing in the morning. But someone, presumably one of my helpful neighbors, had reported me to the HOA within hours. The letter was signed by Patricia Winters, HOA president, with her contact information printed beneath her name in an elaborate script font that seemed designed to convey authority. I called the number immediately. A woman answered on the second ring with a tone that suggested I was interrupting something far more important than whatever petty complaint I might have. Meadowbrook Heights HOA, Patricia speaking. This is Xavier Norris from 4782 Seguero Drive. I just received a fine for having my work equipment visible, and I need to discuss this. Mr. Norris, yes. The violation was documented at approximately 8:30 yesterday evening. Commercial equipment must be stored out of sight according to our community standards. Her voice had that particular quality I had come to recognize in my years dealing with difficult clients. It was the sound of someone who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power over others. Patricia, I understand the rules, but the equipment was there for 1 night. I was planning to move it this morning before I got this letter. Is there any way to waive the fine given the circumstances? The rules are quite clear, Mr. Norris. Visible commercial equipment results in a $500 fine. If you believe the fine was issued in error, you may appeal to the HOA board at our next monthly meeting, which is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks? So I have to pay $500 for parking my skid steer in my own driveway for less than 12 hours. Those are the community standards you agreed to when you purchased your home. The fine is due within 14 days to avoid additional penalties. I felt my jaw clench. What additional penalties? Late fees of $50 per day, plus potential legal action if the balance exceeds 30 days past due. This is absolutely ridiculous. If you choose not to comply with community standards, perhaps Meadowbrook Heights is not the right neighborhood for you, Mr. Norris. Have a pleasant day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. $500 for parking my own equipment on my own property for 1 night. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I walked outside to look at the skid steer, still sitting exactly where I had left it. The machine was clean, well maintained, and represented a significant investment in my business. It was not some rusty eyesore. It was a professional piece of equipment that allowed me to take on larger, more profitable jobs. My neighbor, Tom Richards, was getting his newspaper from the end of his driveway. He looked at me, then at the skid steer, then quickly looked away. Tom had always been friendly enough, but now I wondered if he had been the one to report me. "Morning, Tom," I called out. He gave an awkward wave and hurried back inside his house. So that answered that question. I spent the rest of the morning fuming while I loaded the skid steer back onto my trailer. The work took about 45 minutes, and the entire time I kept thinking about Patricia Winters and her dismissive tone. The way she had implied I should move if I did not like the rules. The way she had made it clear that appealing would be pointless. That afternoon, I drove to the Meadowbrook Heights HOA office, which was located in a small building near the neighborhood's main entrance. The structure was unnecessarily fancy for what amounted to a glorified clubhouse, with decorative columns and landscaping that probably cost more to maintain than my monthly mortgage. Patricia Winters sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a corporate executive's office. She was in her early 50s, with blonde hair styled in a way that suggested weekly salon visits, and she wore a navy blue blazer that screamed middle management. Her expression when she saw me was one of mild irritation. "Mr. Norris, I was not expecting you to visit in person. I wanted to discuss this fine face-to-face. $500 seems excessive for a first-time violation, especially one that lasted less than 12 hours. The fine structure is determined by the board and approved by community vote. It is designed to discourage violations." "It is designed to generate revenue," I corrected. "This is not about maintaining neighborhood standards. This is about finding ways to extract money from homeowners." Patricia's expression hardened. "I take exception to that characterization. The HOA operates as a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving property values and community aesthetics. Then show me some flexibility here. I am not some scofflaw trying to undermine the neighborhood. I am a working professional who made an honest mistake. The rules do not differentiate between honest mistakes and intentional violations. If we started making exceptions, the entire system would collapse. So you will not waive the fine?" "No, Mr. Norris, I will not. And I should mention that according to our records, your front lawn was also half an inch above the permitted height last month, though we issued a warning rather than a fine. This is not your first violation." I stared at her in disbelief. "You are seriously bringing up grass height right now." "I am illustrating a pattern of non-compliance with community standards. My grass was half an inch too tall one time because I was working 12-hour days on a project. I mowed it the same day you sent the warning. Nevertheless, the pattern exists." I realized then that reasoning with Patricia Winters was impossible. She had made up her mind, and nothing I said would change it. She was the type of person who derived satisfaction from enforcing rules, regardless of context or common sense. "Fine," I said. "I will pay your ridiculous fine. But I want you to know this is terrible community management. Your feedback is noted. The payment is due within 14 days. I left the HOA office feeling more frustrated than when I had arrived. On my drive home, I passed the neighborhood's main entrance, a grand affair with stone pillars and an ornate metal gate that spelled out Meadowbrook Heights in flowing letters. There was only one way in and out of the entire development, a decision made by the original developers to create a sense of exclusivity. The entrance road was just wide enough for two vehicles to pass each other, with the HOA office building on the right side and a decorative fountain on the left. An idea began to form in my mind. A terrible, petty, probably stupid idea. But the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. That evening, I reviewed my copy of the HOA covenant in detail. I read Section 17.4, which indeed prohibited commercial vehicles and equipment from being visible from any public street or common area. But I also read Section 3.7, which dealt with parking regulations on common property, and Section 12.2, which covered amendments and enforcement procedures. Nowhere in the document did it specifically prohibit parking on the entrance road, though Section 3.7 mentioned that residents may not block access to common areas or create hazards. The entrance road was technically a common area, maintained by the HOA, but it was also the only access point to over 400 homes. I called my lawyer, Steve Mendoza, who I had used for business contracts and the occasional legal question. He answered on the third ring. "Xavier, what trouble are you getting into now, Steve? I need you to review an HOA covenant and tell me if I am about to do something catastrophically stupid." That is never a good way to start a conversation. What are you planning? I explained the situation with the fine and my developing plan. Steve listened without interrupting, which I took as a bad sign. "Okay," he said when I finished. "First, yes, you would absolutely be creating a massive headache for yourself. Second, you are probably within your technical rights under the covenant as written. Third, the HOA would almost certainly seek an injunction to force you to move, which they would probably get. Fourth, this is going to cost you way more than $500 in the long run. But technically, I would not be violating the covenant, not based on what you just read me. But Xavier, seriously, this is not a good idea. Pay the fine, appeal to the board, and move on with your life. They are not going to overturn the fine on appeal. You know that. Probably not. But creating a war with your HOA is going to make your life miserable for as long as you live there. My life is already miserable if I have to deal with Patricia Winters fining me every time my grass is half an inch too tall." Steve sighed. "If you are determined to do this, at least let me review the full covenant first. Send me a copy and give me 24 hours. And Xavier, really think about whether this is worth it." I sent him the documents and spent the evening considering his advice. The rational part of my brain knew he was right. This was a stupid fight over a stupid fine, and escalating the situation would only make things worse. But another part of me, the part that was tired of being pushed around by petty bureaucrats and their arbitrary rules, wanted to push back. The next morning, Steve called with his analysis. "I reviewed everything. You are technically correct that nothing in the covenant specifically prohibits parking on the entrance road. However, Section 3.7 gives the board broad authority to regulate use of common areas, which they will cite. Also, Section 22.1 allows them to tow vehicles from common areas at the owner's expense. So if you do this, expect your skid steer to be towed within hours." Can they tow it without notice? Not usually, but the covenant has a provision for immediate towing if a vehicle creates a safety hazard or emergency access issue. They would argue blocking the entrance qualifies. What if I am sitting in it? They cannot tow me if I am operating the vehicle. Xavier, now you are talking about a protest action, which opens up different legal issues. They could call the police, who might cite you for blocking traffic or disorderly conduct. On private property, it is an HOA, so the legal status gets complicated. But yes, they could involve law enforcement. Okay, different question. If I park it there and they fine me, can they keep escalating the fines indefinitely? They can fine you according to their fine schedule, which I see caps at $500 per violation, but they can issue multiple violations. So theoretically, they could fine you $500 per day for the same issue. After 30 days, they can file a lien on your property. Jesus. Yeah. HOAs have a disturbing amount of power, which is why I am telling you again, this is not a fight you want to pick. I thanked Steve for his time and sat with the information. Everything he said made sense. This was a losing battle that would cost me money and stress. The smart move was to pay the fine and let it go. But I kept thinking about Patricia Winters and her smug certainty that the rules were the rules, with no room for human judgment or compassion. I thought about the possibility of spending the next however many years dealing with constant violations for meaningless infractions. I thought about the principle of the thing. That weekend, I drove my skid steer to the Meadowbrook Heights entrance and parked it directly in the center of the access road, about 20 feet inside the gate. The machine sat there like a bright yellow middle finger, completely blocking both lanes. No one was getting in or out without going around it, which was impossible given the pillars on either side. I positioned myself in the operator's seat and waited. It took exactly 9 minutes before the first car arrived. A silver Mercedes sedan pulled up to the entrance and stopped when the driver saw my skid steer blocking the way. The window rolled down and a man in his 60s stuck his head out. "Excuse me, you are blocking the road." "I am aware," I called back. "Well, can you move?" "I need to get into the neighborhood." "Sorry, I am not moving right now." His face reddened. "This is ridiculous. Move your equipment." "I am parked legally on HOA common property. I will move when I am ready to move." "I am calling the HOA. Feel free." He pulled out his phone, still sitting in his car, and I watched him have an animated conversation with someone. When he finished, he glared at me. "Patricia Winters is on her way. You are in serious trouble." "Looking forward to it," I said. 3 more cars arrived over the next 10 minutes, creating a line of frustrated residents who all had essentially the same conversation with me. Some were polite but confused. Others were angry and threatening. I remained calm and repeated that I was legally parked on common property and would move when I was ready. Patricia Winters arrived in a white Lexus SUV that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. She parked at an angle and got out, marching toward my skid steer with an expression that could have melted steel. "Mr. Norris, what exactly do you think you are doing?" "Hello, Patricia. I am parking my skid steer on HOA common property. Since you made it clear that I cannot park it on my own driveway, I figured this was the next best option. You are blocking the only entrance to the neighborhood. This is completely unacceptable. Is there a rule against parking here?" I reviewed the covenant pretty carefully and I could not find one. Section 3.7 prohibits blocking access to common areas. But I am not blocking access to a common area. I am using a common area. The entrance road is for the use of all residents, and as a resident, I am using it. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This is not funny, Mr. Norris. You are creating a safety hazard and preventing residents from accessing their homes. You created a $500 hazard to my bank account over parking my equipment in my driveway for a few hours." I figured turnabout was fair play. "If you do not move this machine immediately, I will call a towing company." "Go ahead. But you should know that I am currently sitting in it, which means it is an occupied vehicle. Good luck getting someone to tow an occupied vehicle from private property." Patricia pulled out her phone and made a call. I could not hear her exact words, but her tone was clipped and angry. She paced back and forth while talking, occasionally pointing at me for emphasis, even though the person on the other end could not see her. When she finished, she walked back over. "The police are on their way." "Okay. You are going to be arrested for blocking traffic and creating a public disturbance." "We will see." More cars had accumulated behind Patricia's Lexus, and several residents had gotten out to see what was happening. I recognized a few faces from neighborhood gatherings, though no one looked particularly sympathetic to my situation. Mostly, they just looked annoyed that their afternoon was being disrupted. The Phoenix Police Department arrived about 15 minutes later in the form of 2 officers in a patrol car. They parked behind the line of civilian vehicles and walked up to assess the situation. One was a younger guy, probably in his late 20s, and the other was a woman who looked like she had been doing this job for a while. Patricia immediately started talking to them, gesturing at me and the skid steer while explaining how I was blocking access and creating a safety hazard. The officers listened patiently, then walked over to me. "Sir, I am Officer Martinez," the woman said. "Can you explain what is going on here? My name is Xavier Norris. I live at 4782 Seguero Drive in this neighborhood. The HOA recently fined me $500 for parking this skid steer in my own driveway overnight. Since they made it clear I cannot park on my property, I decided to park on HOA common property instead. So this is a dispute with your homeowners association?" "Yes, madam." Officer Martinez looked at her partner, then back at me. "Mr. Norris, I understand you are frustrated with your HOA, but you cannot block the entrance to a residential neighborhood. People need to access their homes. I am not blocking anything illegally. I reviewed the HOA covenant, and there is no prohibition against parking on the entrance road. This is a civil matter between me and the HOA. That may be true, but you are still preventing access, which creates a public safety issue. What if there is a fire or medical emergency? Then I would move immediately. I am not trying to endanger anyone. I am making a point." The younger officer, whose name tag Reed Davidson, spoke up. "Making a point is fine, but you are going about it the wrong way. You need to move your vehicle." "Or what? Are you going to arrest me?" "For what crime?" Officer Martinez sighed. "We could cite you for obstruction of traffic or disorderly conduct. On private property that I have legal access to as a resident, the entrance road serves a public function, even if it is technically private property. With respect, officer, I think if you cite me, I will fight it and win. This is a civil dispute. The HOA can take me to court if they want, but you do not have grounds to arrest me." Patricia had walked up during this conversation. "Officers, this man is clearly violating multiple community rules and creating a hazard. He needs to be removed." Officer Martinez turned to her. "Madam, this is a civil matter between you and Mr. Norris. We can ask him to move, but we cannot force him to move unless he is committing a crime. He is blocking traffic on private property. If you want him removed, you will need to go through your HOA's legal procedures, probably starting with a civil injunction." Patricia looked like she was about to explode. "So you are not going to do anything?" "We are going to advise Mr. Norris that he should move his vehicle to avoid escalating this situation. But no, we are not going to arrest him for a civil HOA dispute." Officer Martinez looked back at me. "Mr. Norris, I strongly encourage you to move your skid steer and resolve this through proper channels. This is only going to create more problems for you." "I appreciate the advice, officer, but I am going to stay here until the HOA agrees to waive the bogus fine they hit me with." "That is your choice, but understand that the HOA will likely pursue legal action, and you will end up spending a lot more than $500 on attorneys. I am prepared for that." The officers left after confirming that I was not going to move. Patricia watched them drive away, then turned her fury on me. "You have not heard the last of this, Mr. Norris. I am calling an emergency board meeting, and we will take every legal action available to remove you and fine you into oblivion." "Looking forward to it, Patricia. Maybe while you are having your emergency meeting, you can discuss whether $500 fines for overnight parking are reasonable." She stormed back to her Lexus and executed a sharp three-point turn to exit the neighborhood the wrong way, driving on the landscaped shoulder to get around the line of cars. Several other residents followed her lead, tearing up the grass in their desperation to get out. I settled in for a long afternoon. More residents arrived home from work as the evening approached, and the line of frustrated people grew longer. Some tried to reason with me. Others threatened legal action. A few actually seemed amused by the situation. One guy in a pickup truck even gave me a thumbs up and said, "About time someone stood up to that woman." But mostly, people were just annoyed. I could not blame them. They had nothing to do with my dispute with the HOA, and I was making their lives difficult. But I also knew that if I backed down now, Patricia Winters would take it as confirmation that she could bully any resident into submission. Around 6 o'clock, a tow truck arrived. The driver was a heavy-set man with a beard who looked at my skid steer, then at me sitting in it, then back at the skid steer. "You the owner of this machine?" he called out. "I am. HOA called me to tow it, but you are sitting in it." "That is correct." He scratched his beard. "Yeah, I cannot tow an occupied vehicle. That is a whole liability nightmare I do not need." "I appreciate your professionalism." "No problem. I still get my service call fee from the HOA, so it is all the same to me. Have a good evening." He left, and I allowed myself a small smile. Patricia had tried her best card and come up empty. As darkness fell, someone delivered pizzas to the waiting residents, apparently paid for by the HOA as a goodwill gesture. I had to admit that was a smart move. Keep the neighbors fed and happy while they waited out the crazy guy on the skid steer. I had brought sandwiches and water, anticipating a long haul. I also had a portable battery pack to keep my phone charged. The skid steer's fuel tank was full, so I could run the heater if it got cold, though October in Phoenix rarely required heat. Around 8 o'clock, a news van pulled up. Channel 12 had somehow gotten wind of the situation, and a reporter with perfect hair and a camera operator started interviewing residents. I saw Patricia talking to them, no doubt explaining what a terrible person I was for blocking the entrance. Eventually, the reporter approached me. "Sir, I am Michelle Torres with Channel 12 News. Can you tell us why you are blocking the entrance to Meadowbrook Heights?" I had not anticipated media attention, but I decided to use it to my advantage. "My name is Xavier Norris, and I am a resident here. The HOA fined me $500 for parking my work equipment in my driveway overnight while I was exhausted after a long day. When I tried to appeal the fine, the HOA president told me the rules were the rules with no exceptions. So I am parking my equipment here instead, on HOA common property, until they agree to apply some common sense to their enforcement. And you are aware this is blocking hundreds of residents from accessing their homes." "I am, and I regret the inconvenience to my neighbors. But sometimes you have to make noise to be heard. HOAs across the country abuse their power and fine residents for trivial violations while hiding behind rigid rules. Someone needs to push back. The HOA claims you are creating a safety hazard. If there is a genuine emergency, I will move immediately. My dispute is with the HOA's unfair fine structure, not with public safety." Michelle Torres thanked me and went to film a stand-up in front of my skid steer. I saw the live truck satellite dish go up, which meant they were going to broadcast this story on the evening news. My phone started ringing almost immediately. The first call was from my mother. "Xavier James Norris, what on earth are you doing? You are on the news." "Hi, Mom. I am having a disagreement with my HOA. By blocking an entire neighborhood. Have you lost your mind?" "Probably. But I am tired of being pushed around by bureaucrats on power trips. This is not how you solve problems, sweetheart. You look like a crazy person on television." "Maybe. but at least people are paying attention." She sighed in that way only mothers can. "Please be careful and call me when you get home." "I will, Mom." The next call was from Steve, my lawyer. "Xavier, I am watching the news right now. Please tell me that is not you." "Okay, I will not tell you that. You are killing me. Do you have any idea how much worse you just made this?" How could it be worse? The HOA was already going to fine me into oblivion. Now they have video evidence of you deliberately blocking the entrance. That strengthens their case for an injunction and probably for increased fines. Plus, you are creating negative publicity for yourself. Potential clients are going to see this and think twice about hiring you. That thought had not occurred to me. I am standing up for myself, Steve. That is not a bad look. It is when you are blocking an entire neighborhood to do it. Look, I get it. You are angry, but this is not the way. What is the way? Pay their ridiculous fines and let them keep abusing their power. Yes, actually. Then you sell your house and move somewhere without an HOA. This fight is not worth your business and reputation. I will think about it. Think fast, because the HOA's lawyer is probably drafting an emergency injunction right now. He was right, of course. Around 9 o'clock, Patricia Winters returned with a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. They approached my skid steer together. "Mr. Norris, this is Robert Kensington, the HOA's attorney. He has something for you." Robert stepped forward and handed me a document. "Mr. Norris, this is a temporary restraining order issued by Judge Wallace of the Maricopa County Superior Court. It orders you to immediately remove your vehicle from the entrance road and prohibits you from blocking access to the neighborhood. Violation of this order can result in arrest for contempt of court." I took the document and read it by flashlight. Sure enough, Judge Wallace had signed an emergency order based on the HOA's petition, finding that my actions created an immediate threat to public safety and access. "How did you get a judge to sign this at 9 o'clock at night?" I asked. "Judge Wallace handles emergency petitions. We explained the situation and he agreed this warranted immediate action." I looked at Patricia. Her expression was triumphant. "So I move now or I get arrested." "That is correct," Robert said. "And I should inform you that the HOA board held an emergency meeting this evening. In addition to your original $500 fine, you are now being assessed a $500 fine for each hour you blocked the entrance, starting from 2 o'clock this afternoon. That brings your total to $4,000 and counting." $4,000. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. The board has discretion to impose fines for violations, and your actions today constitute multiple serious violations of community rules. Additionally, the HOA will be seeking to recover legal fees associated with obtaining this restraining order, which will likely add another $2,000 to $3,000 to your balance. Patricia finally spoke. "I told you that you had not heard the last of this, Mr. Norris. The rules exist for a reason, and when you break them, there are consequences." I sat in the operator's seat, looking at the restraining order, trying to process how quickly this had spiraled out of control. I had started the day trying to make a point about an unfair $500 fine. Now I was facing $7,000 in debt, a court order, and possible arrest if I did not comply. "I assume you are going to move now?" Robert asked. "Give me a minute to think." "There is nothing to think about. You have a court order. Either comply or face arrest." I started the skid steer and slowly drove it off the entrance road, parking it on the street outside the neighborhood gates. The line of waiting residents erupted in cheers and honks. Cars started streaming into the neighborhood, and people glared at me as they passed. Patricia and Robert watched from the sidewalk. When I shut off the engine and climbed down, Robert handed me another document. This is a formal notice of your outstanding fines and legal fees. Payment is due within 14 days. If you fail to pay, the HOA will file a lien against your property. Can I at least appeal this to the full board? You may submit a written appeal within 7 days. The board will consider it at their next regular meeting. When is that? 3 weeks from now. Of course it was. I drove home in my truck, leaving the skid steer parked on the public street. My house was dark and empty, which matched my mood. I sat at my kitchen table and spread out all the documents. The original $500 fine for parking in my driveway, the new fines for blocking the entrance, the legal fees, the restraining order. It was a mountain of paper that represented a complete disaster. I called Steve again. I moved it. They hit me with $4,000 in additional fines plus legal fees. Jesus. Xavier, I am sorry. I tried to warn you. I know. What are my options? Pay the fines and appeal. You will almost certainly lose the appeal, but at least you will have followed the process. Then consider your options for moving forward. What if I cannot pay $7,000? They will file a lien, and eventually they can force a sale of your property to recover the debt. HOAs have a scary amount of power when it comes to collections. So I am just screwed. You are in a bad spot, yes, but you made it worse by blocking the entrance. That was the moment you went from sympathetic homeowner to neighborhood pariah. Noted. Thanks for the support. I am being realistic, Xavier. You asked me for legal advice and I am giving it to you. Pay the fines, appeal the decision, and start looking for a new place to live. This neighborhood is never going to be comfortable for you again. I hung up and stared at the ceiling. Steve was right. Even if I somehow won my appeal, which I would not, every person in Meadowbrook Heights now knew me as the guy who blocked the entrance. My neighbors hated me. The HOA had marked me as a troublemaker. There was no coming back from this. The next morning, I woke up to find my truck had been egged during the night. Bright yellow yolk dripped down the windshield and doors. A note was tucked under the wiper blade. Move out, troublemaker. I cleaned the truck and went to work, trying to focus on the grading project I was currently managing. But my crew could tell something was wrong, and eventually my foreman, Carlos, pulled me aside. Boss, you okay? You seem distracted. Just dealing with some personal stuff. The thing on the news last night, so my crew had seen it too. Great. Yeah, that. For what it is worth, I think you got a raw deal. My brother lives in an HOA and they are constantly hassling him about stupid stuff. Somebody needs to stand up to them. Appreciate it, Carlos. But standing up to them just cost me $7,000 and made my entire neighborhood hate me. Still, though, you made a point. I wished making a point felt more satisfying. Over the next few days, I submitted my written appeal to the HOA board. I laid out my argument that the original fine was excessive for a first-time, short-duration violation, and that the additional fines for blocking the entrance were punitive and disproportionate. I acknowledged that blocking the entrance was wrong, but argued that it was a direct result of the HOA's unreasonable enforcement practices. I also pointed out that the covenant did not actually specify a fine amount for blocking common areas, which meant the board had likely exceeded its authority by assessing $500 per hour. The response came via email from Patricia Winters. The board would consider my appeal at their next meeting, but she wanted me to know that the board members were disappointed and concerned by my actions. She also noted that several residents had filed complaints about my conduct, and the board was considering additional sanctions. What additional sanctions could they possibly impose? They had already fined me more than my monthly mortgage payment. I paid the original $500 fine to stop the daily late fees from piling up, but I held off on paying the additional fines until after the appeal. That left me in a precarious position, with the clock ticking toward a potential lien on my property. The local news ran a follow-up story a few days later. They interviewed several Meadowbrook Heights residents who expressed outrage at my actions. One woman, who I recognized from neighborhood barbecues, said I was selfish and childish for blocking the entrance. A man I had never met said the HOA should kick people like him out if they could not follow the rules. They also interviewed someone from a statewide HOA reform group, who argued that my case illustrated the need for better oversight of homeowners associations. She pointed out that many HOAs impose fines that are disproportionate to the violations, and that homeowners have limited recourse when boards abuse their power. The story was more balanced than the first one, but the damage to my reputation was done. I was the guy who blocked the neighborhood entrance over a fine. Context did not matter to most people. 3 weeks felt like 3 months, but finally the day of the board meeting arrived. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the parking lot already full. Apparently word had gotten out that my appeal would be heard, and residents wanted to watch. The clubhouse was set up like a small auditorium, with rows of chairs facing a raised table where the 5 board members sat. Patricia Winters was in the center, flanked by 2 members on each side. I recognized one of them, a retired engineer named Donald who lived 3 streets over from me. The others were strangers. Every seat was filled and more people stood along the walls. The crowd was not friendly. I could feel the hostility in the room as I walked to the front where appellants were supposed to sit. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through the standard procedural items. Then she reached my appeal. Next, we have an appeal from Xavier Norris of 4782 Sagaro Drive regarding fines assessed for parking a commercial vehicle in his driveway and subsequently blocking the neighborhood entrance. Mr. Norris, you have 10 minutes to present your appeal. I stood and walked to the podium that had been set up for residents to address the board. Thank you for hearing my appeal. As you know, I was fined $500 for parking my skid steer in my driveway overnight while I was exhausted after a long workday. I understand there are rules about visible commercial equipment, but I believe this fine was excessive given the circumstances. It was a first-time violation that lasted less than 12 hours, and I moved the equipment as soon as I was able the next morning. I paused, looking at the board members. Most avoided eye contact. When I tried to discuss the fine with Patricia, I was told the rules are the rules with no exceptions. That struck me as unnecessarily rigid, especially for a minor violation. So I made a poor decision to park my equipment on the entrance road as a form of protest. I acknowledge that was wrong, and I apologize for the inconvenience it caused to my neighbors. Someone in the audience muttered, "Too late for apologies." I continued. However, I believe the additional fines assessed by the board are excessive and potentially beyond the scope of the board's authority. The covenant does not specify a fine structure for blocking common areas, which means the board created these penalties after the fact. That seems like a due process issue. Patricia leaned forward. Mr. Norris, Section 8.3 of the covenant gives the board broad discretion to assess fines for violations up to $500 per violation. We determined that each hour you blocked the entrance constituted a separate violation. But that is a legal fiction. It was one continuous action, not 8 separate violations. The board has the authority to interpret the rules, Mr. Norris. And our interpretation is that your prolonged blockage warranted multiple fines. Then I would argue that is an abuse of discretion. One of the other board members, A woman with gray hair whose name placard reads Susan something spoke up. "Mr. Norris, you created a dangerous situation that prevented emergency access to 400 homes. What if there had been a fire? What if someone needed an ambulance?" I stated clearly that I would move immediately for any emergency, and there was no emergency during the time I was there. "But there could have been. You put the entire neighborhood at risk to make a point about a $500 fine." She was right, of course. I had put my anger ahead of common sense. Donald, the retired engineer, cleared his throat. "I would like to ask Mr. Norris a question. Did you review the covenant before purchasing your home?" "I did, though admittedly not as carefully as I should have." "And did you understand that there were rules regarding commercial vehicles when you moved in?" "I did." "Then you knowingly purchased a home in a community with rules you now claim are unfair. Is that correct?" "The rules themselves are not necessarily unfair. It is the rigid enforcement without consideration of context that I find problematic." "But the rules are only effective if they are enforced consistently. If we start making exceptions based on individual circumstances, we create a situation where some homeowners get special treatment while others do not. That leads to complaints of favoritism and unfair application." He had a point too. The board was stuck between rigid enforcement and subjective judgment calls, and there was no perfect answer. Patricia looked at the other board members. "Does anyone else have questions for Mr. Norris?" They shook their heads. "Then we will take a 15-minute recess to deliberate. Mr. Norris, please wait outside." I walked out into the hallway, where several residents stood talking in small groups. They stopped when they saw me and resumed their conversations in quieter tones. I caught snippets about property values and troublemakers, and hoped they were not planning to egg my truck again. Steve had warned me that the appeal would be a formality, and I was starting to believe he was right. The board had already made up its mind. This meeting was just checking a procedural box. After 20 minutes, someone called me back inside. The room had gotten even more crowded somehow, with people pressed shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Patricia read from a prepared statement. "The board has carefully considered Mr. Norris's appeal. With respect to the original $500 fine for parking a commercial vehicle in violation of Section 17.4, we find the fine was appropriately assessed under the community guidelines. Mr. Norris admits he was in violation, and the fine structure does not distinguish between first-time violations and repeat offenses." My heart sank. "With respect to the additional fines for blocking the entrance road, we find these were also appropriately assessed. Mr. Norris's actions created a dangerous situation and inconvenienced hundreds of residents for over 7 hours. The board determined that each hour constituted a separate violation warranting a separate fine. Furthermore, Mr. Norris's actions required the HOA to incur significant legal expenses to obtain emergency relief from the court. We find it appropriate that Mr. Norris bear these costs." She looked directly at me. "However, the board recognizes that the total financial burden may be disproportionate to your ability to pay. Therefore, we are willing to offer a payment plan that spreads the costs over 12 months with no additional interest. We are also willing to reduce the total amount by $1,000 if you agree to sell your home and leave the neighborhood within 6 months." The room erupted in murmurs. I stood there, processing what I had just heard. They were giving me a choice: pay $7,000 over a year or pay $6,000 and leave my home. "That is your offer," I asked. "Pay up or get out." "It is a reasonable compromise given your actions, Mr. Norris." The board could pursue the full amount immediately and force a sale through the lien process, which would be much more expensive for you. This is extortion. It is an offer to resolve this matter with minimal additional conflict. You have 7 days to accept or reject it. If you reject it, the full amount becomes due immediately. I looked at the 5 board members, all of whom seemed perfectly content with this outcome. Then I looked at the crowd of residents, most of whom seemed pleased that the troublemaker was getting what he deserved. "I will give you my answer in 7 days," I said. I left the meeting and sat in my truck for a long time, trying to figure out my next move. The smart play was probably to take the payment plan and start looking for a new house. I could not afford to pay $6,000 or $7,000 all at once, and fighting the HOA in court would cost even more with no guarantee of success. But another part of me was furious at being forced out of my home over a stupid fine. This was not justice. This was a power play by a petty bureaucrat who enjoyed punishing people. I drove home and spent the evening researching HOA law in Arizona. I learned that homeowners associations were governed by a combination of state statutes and their own covenants, and that courts generally gave boards wide discretion in enforcing rules. However, there were limits. Fines had to be reasonable and proportionate. Enforcement had to be consistent. And boards could not act in ways that were arbitrary or capricious. The question was whether Patricia and her board had crossed any of those lines. I called Steve the next morning. They offered me a payment plan or a discount if I agree to sell and move out. "That is actually more generous than I expected. You should take it." "Steve, they are forcing me out of my home over a parking violation. They are offering to reduce your debt if you choose to leave. That is different from forcing you out. And frankly, Xavier, staying there is going to be miserable. Your neighbors hate you. The HOA is going to scrutinize everything you do. Every blade of grass, every paint chip, every tiny violation will result in another fine. Is that how you want to live?" "No, but I should not have to move because I stood up to an unfair system." "You did not stand up to an unfair system. You blocked an entire neighborhood for 7 hours and made everyone's life difficult. I know you think you were making a principled stand, but from the outside, it looks like a tantrum." His words stung because they were true. I had let my anger override my judgment, and now I was paying the price. So what do I do? Take the payment plan. Start looking for a new place without an HOA. Cut your losses and move on. And if I want to fight this, then you are looking at tens of thousands in legal fees, years of litigation, and a very slim chance of success. The law is on the HOA's side, Xavier. I am sorry, but that is the reality. I thanked him and hung up. Then I did something I probably should have done weeks ago. I started looking at houses outside Meadowbrook Heights. Over the next few days, I toured several properties in Phoenix suburbs that were not part of HOA communities. They were generally older homes, less manicured, with more character and fewer restrictions. I found a place in Glendale that needed some work but had a large driveway and no busybody neighbors to complain about my equipment. I made an offer, which was accepted. Then I called Patricia Winters. "I will take your offer. I will pay $6,000 over 12 months and sell my house within 6 months. "That is a wise decision, Mr. Norris. I will have our attorney draw up the agreement. Patricia, can I ask you something? What is it? Do you actually enjoy this? Fining people and forcing them to follow arbitrary rules. Does it make you feel powerful?" There was a long pause. "I do not expect you to understand, Mr. Norris, but my job is to maintain property values and community standards for hundreds of families. That requires consistent enforcement of the rules, even when individual homeowners find them inconvenient. If I made exceptions for everyone who thought they deserved special treatment, the entire system would collapse. But you could use judgment. You could recognize the difference between someone trying to skirt the rules and someone who made an honest mistake. And then, I would face accusations of favoritism and inconsistent enforcement. The rules are the rules because they treat everyone equally. The rules treat everyone equally badly. That is your opinion. Most residents appreciate the structure and standards that come with HOA living. Most residents have never been on the wrong end of a $500 fine. Goodbye, Mr. Norris. I will send you the payment agreement. She hung up. I signed the agreement when it arrived and made my first payment. Then I listed my house with a realtor who specialized in HOA communities. She warned me that the recent publicity might hurt the sale, but she thought we could find a buyer within the 6-month window. I was right. The house sat on the market for 2 months with only a few showings. Finally, a young couple from out of state made an offer that was $10,000 below my asking price. I took it because I needed to close the deal before my deadline. The day I moved out of Meadowbrook Heights was bittersweet. I had lived there for 3 years, and despite everything, it had been my home. But I felt a weight lift as I drove out through those ornate entrance gates for the last time. My new place in Glendale was not as fancy. The landscaping was not professionally maintained. The paint was not perfectly uniform. But I could park my skid steer in the driveway all week if I wanted, and nobody would send me a $500 fine. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. 6 months after I moved out, I got a call from Carlos, my foreman. "Boss, you need to see the news. Your old HOA is in serious trouble." I pulled up the local news website and saw the headline: Meadowbrook Heights HOA president arrested for embezzlement. The story reported that Patricia Winters had been arrested and charged with stealing over $200,000 from the HOA's reserve fund over a 3-year period. An audit triggered by complaints from residents revealed that she had been writing checks to shell companies she controlled, supposedly for maintenance and legal services that were never actually provided. I felt a strange mix of emotions reading the article. Vindication that Patricia was not the righteous enforcer of rules she pretended to be. Anger that she had been stealing from residents while lecturing them about community standards. And a grim satisfaction that her rigid, punitive approach to HOA management had finally caught up with her. The article mentioned that several residents were planning to sue the HOA for mismanagement, and that the remaining board members had all resigned. The homeowners association was in chaos, with no leadership and a massive budget deficit thanks to Patricia's theft. I wondered if Tom Richards, my neighbor who had reported me for the skid steer violation, was one of the people planning to sue. I wondered if any of the residents who had cheered when I was fined realized that their HOA president was a criminal. A few weeks later, I got a call from Donald, the retired engineer who had been on the board. I almost did not answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Mr. Norris, this is Donald Peterson from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA board. Former board, I suppose I should say. I saw the news about Patricia. That is quite a situation." "Yes, it is. I am calling because several of us who served on the board during your appeal have been discussing what happened. We wanted to apologize. I was not expecting that." "Apologize for what?" "For not seeing what was happening." Patricia controlled the flow of information to the board. She told us what to think, what to approve, what to enforce. We rubber-stamped her decisions because we trusted her judgment, but we should have been more diligent. We should have questioned why fines were so high and enforcement was so rigid. And we should have questioned the legal bills that, we now know, were mostly fictional. I appreciate you saying that, Donald. I also wanted you to know that the new interim board reviewed your case. We all agreed that the fines assessed against you were excessive and that Patricia likely pushed for maximum penalties because you challenged her authority. If you are willing, we would like to refund $3,000 of what you paid." I sat down, stunned. "You are serious?" "Completely." "It is the least we can do. Patricia turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom, and you were one of many residents who suffered because of it. We are trying to make things right. I already moved and sold my house. I know, but you still deserve fairness, even if it comes late." We made arrangements for the HOA to send me a check. Donald also mentioned that the new board was completely revising the fine structure and enforcement policies to make them more reasonable and proportionate. "We are trying to learn from this disaster," he said. "HOAs serve an important function, but they need oversight and accountability. Patricia had neither, and look what happened." I thanked him and hung up. A few weeks later, the check arrived with a letter from the new board, formally apologizing for the excessive fines and rigid enforcement during Patricia Winters' tenure. I deposited the check and used some of the money to buy new equipment for my business. The rest went into savings. The legal case against Patricia Winters moved slowly through the court system, as these things always do. She was charged with theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The prosecution argued that she had systematically stolen from the HOA over several years, using her position of trust to hide her crimes. Patricia pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive defense attorney who argued that the payments were legitimate and that any financial irregularities were the result of poor bookkeeping rather than criminal intent. But the evidence was overwhelming. The shell companies she had created existed only on paper. The services they supposedly provided were never actually rendered, and her personal bank accounts showed large deposits that coincided with HOA checks to these fake companies. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I followed it in the news but did not attend in person. I had moved on with my life and did not need to see Patricia Winters get her comeuppance in person. The jury found her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, though everyone knew she had already spent most of the money and would never be able to pay it back. Several residents were interviewed after the sentencing. One woman said she felt betrayed by someone she had trusted to manage the community. A man said he hoped this would serve as a warning to other HOA boards to provide better oversight. Tom Richards, my old neighbor, said he was just glad it was over. I never heard anyone mention my case specifically, but I like to think that some of those residents remembered the guy who got fined for parking his skid steer overnight. Maybe they wondered if Patricia had been stealing money back then too. Maybe they realized that her rigid enforcement of petty rules was part of a larger pattern of abusing her authority. Or maybe they just moved on with their lives, the same way I had. Life in Glendale was different from Meadowbrook Heights. My neighbors were not particularly interested in what I did with my property as long as I did not bother them. I could park my skid steer in the driveway for days at a time without anyone complaining. My grass could be an inch too tall or too short, and the world kept turning. I still followed HOA news stories with morbid fascination. Every few months, there would be another report about an HOA fining someone for painting their house the wrong shade of beige or flying the wrong flag or planting the wrong flowers. And every time, I felt grateful that I had escaped that world. My business continued to grow. Carlos eventually became a partner, and we landed several large commercial contracts that kept us busy and profitable. Some of my old clients from Meadowbrook Heights continued to hire me for projects, which suggested that my reputation had survived the entrance-blocking incident. One afternoon, about 2 years after I moved out of the neighborhood, I drove past Meadowbrook Heights on my way to a job site. I slowed down as I approached the entrance with its ornate gate and stone pillars. The landscaping looked a bit less perfect than I remembered. The fountain was turned off. A sign near the entrance advertised homes for sale, suggesting that Patricia's crimes had hurt property values. I thought about stopping to see if any of my old neighbors were around, but I decided against it. That chapter of my life was closed. I had paid my fines, sold my house, and moved on. But I did allow myself a moment of satisfaction remembering that 7-hour protest with my skid steer blocking the entrance. It had been stupid and counterproductive, and had cost me thousands of dollars. But it had also been the moment I decided to stop letting petty bureaucrats push me around. Sometimes standing up for yourself is expensive. Sometimes it backfires. But sometimes, years later, you find out that you were right all along, and the people wielding power over you were the real problem. I drove past Meadowbrook Heights and continued on to my job site, where my bright yellow skid steer was already waiting on the trailer, ready for another day of productive work. No HOA fines, no violation notices. Just me, my equipment, and the freedom to run my business without someone telling me where I could park. That, I decided, was worth more than any perfectly manicured lawn or uniform paint scheme could ever be worth. The sun was setting over Phoenix, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, and I felt genuinely content with where my life had ended up. The fight with Patricia Winters and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA had been painful and expensive, but it had taught me valuable lessons about picking my battles, understanding when to walk away, and recognizing that sometimes the system really is broken. I never regretted blocking that entrance for 7 hours, even though it cost me dearly. Sometimes you have to make a statement, even if the statement is messy and imperfect and causes problems for innocent people. Sometimes the only way to expose an abuse of power is to push back so hard that everyone has to pay attention. And sometimes, if you are lucky, the universe eventually proves you were right all along. Patricia Winters was sitting in prison for stealing from the same community she claimed to protect. The residents of Meadowbrook Heights were learning hard lessons about accountability and oversight. And I was living in a house where I could park my skid steer anywhere I wanted without fear of a $500 fine. Justice, I decided, does not always arrive quickly or cleanly, but sometimes it arrives nonetheless. As I pulled into the job site and began unloading my equipment, I thought about all the homeowners currently trapped in HOA disputes across America. People being fined for trivial violations. People being forced to change things that did not need changing. People being bullied by board members who enjoyed their tiny amount of power just a little too much. I hoped some of them would fight back. Not necessarily by blocking entrances, because that was probably not the smartest move, but by pushing for reform, demanding accountability, and refusing to accept that the rules are the rules without question or context. HOAs are not going away. Too many neighborhoods already have them, and too many developers see them as useful tools for maintaining property values. But they can be better. They can be more reasonable. They can balance enforcement with common sense. They just need residents willing to demand it. I spent the rest of the afternoon grading the lot, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of the work. The skid steer hummed beneath me, responsive and reliable, the same machine that had caused so much trouble 2 years ago. But here, in this unincorporated part of Phoenix without an HOA, it was just a tool. Not a violation, not a fine, not evidence of commercial activity that might slightly reduce someone's property value. Just a machine doing the job it was built to do. When I finished for the day and loaded the skid steer back onto the trailer, I took a moment to appreciate the simple freedom of not having to worry about where I parked it. I could take it home and leave it in my driveway for a week if I wanted. I could wash it in my yard. I could make as much noise as I needed to make, within reason, without someone measuring decibel levels and issuing violation notices. That was worth everything I had gone through. I drove home as the Phoenix evening cooled from blazing to merely warm, past neighborhoods with HOAs and neighborhoods without, past houses that looked identical and houses that looked unique, past people living under community standards and people living however they pleased. And I felt grateful, genuinely grateful, that I had ended up on the side of freedom rather than uniformity. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was my mother. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart. I just wanted to check in. Are you doing okay?" "I am doing great, actually. I saw another news story about that awful woman from your old neighborhood. 6 years in prison. I hope you feel vindicated." "I do, a little, but mostly I am just glad I am out of there. Your father and I are proud of you for standing up for yourself, even if we thought you went about it the wrong way." "Thanks, Mom. I think I went about it the wrong way too, but it worked out in the end. That is all that matters. Come visit us this weekend. I will make your favorite." "I will be there." I hung up and looked at my house, my driveway, my skid steer sitting safely on its trailer. No violation notices. No fines. No Patricia Winters telling me the rules are the rules with no exceptions. Just home. I walked inside, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat on my back porch watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in a prison about 40 miles away, Patricia Winters was probably eating dinner in a cafeteria and thinking about the choices that had led her there. Somewhere in Meadowbrook Heights, residents were probably arguing with their new board about some trivial issue. And somewhere in Phoenix, another homeowner was probably receiving their first violation notice and wondering whether to fight or comply. I hope they chose to fight, but smarter than I did. The stars began to appear overhead, distant and indifferent to the small dramas of HOAs and fines and skid steers. I finished my beer and went inside to make dinner, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The story of Xavier Norris versus the Meadowbrook Heights HOA was over. Patricia Winters had been brought to justice. I had been partially vindicated and refunded, and life had moved on. But somewhere in my garage, carefully filed away, I kept copies of all the documents from that fight. The violation notices, the fines, the restraining order, the appeal, the refund check, and a printed screenshot of the news article announcing Patricia's arrest, not because I wanted to dwell on the past, but because I wanted to remember. Remember that fighting injustice is sometimes necessary. Remember that authority figures are not always right. Remember that standing up for yourself has costs, but so does staying silent. And remember that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe rewards people who refuse to be pushed around. I kept those documents as a reminder to never again live somewhere with a homeowners association, and as evidence in case anyone ever doubted that the fight had been worth it, because it had been worth it. Every dollar, every hour, every moment of frustration and anger and vindication. Some battles you fight because you have to. Some battles you fight because you should. And some battles you fight simply because someone needs to say enough is enough. My battle with Patricia Winters and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA had been all three. And looking back now, from the safety and freedom of my HOA-free home, I would not change a thing. Well, maybe I would not have blocked the entrance for 7 hours. That part was probably excessive, but the spirit of it, the refusal to accept unreasonable punishment for a trivial violation, the willingness to push back against someone abusing their authority. That part I would do again in a heartbeat. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I smiled thinking about my bright yellow skid steer sitting in the driveway, visible to anyone who cared to look, generating exactly 0 fines and 0 violations. Freedom, I decided, looks a lot like a Bobcat T595 parked wherever the hell I want to park it. And that was worth more than any perfectly maintained HOA neighborhood could ever be.